Are we working? I think we are.
Let's move that up.
Move it up. I'm not sure you want me louder. So, it is good to be with you. Thanks so much for that introduction. I've known Joel since he was about that tall, I think. His dad and I were good friends many years ago, and it's good to be in Kansas. I've officially been invited back for every basketball game so far this year, the rest of the year, since you pulled it off last night. So, good job. Yeah. So I'm the reason. So now I can't get our Oklahoma State Cowboys to hardly win a game except when we play Kansas State, but that's kind of it. So anyway, it's good to be with you. We've certainly been through a challenging period here. As a matter of fact, one of the most challenging periods ever for the U.S. pork industry. And we're going to talk about that. The good thing is, I've told people that the last year I've kind of felt like Darth Vader at all these meetings. You know, nothing good can come out of this. And things are looking better. And we're going to talk about kind of the prospects for that now as we go forward. I need to show you this disclaimer. Partners for Production Agriculture was merged with EverAg last summer, summer before last. And so some of my logos are a little old. I've got the EverAg one here, and you'll see the Partners for Production Ag logo in some places. But we are part of EverAg, which is kind of a descendant of Dairy.com. And we do advise people in the trading of futures and options, and those are risky investments. And as Joe always points out, you know, if what this really says is if you trade anything that I say here today and lose money, it's your fault, not mine. So, okay. Now, another one is that nothing that I say here should be construed as trying to get anybody to agree to decisions on pricing or output. These are my opinions of what the market will force on us and will cause to happen in the industry. Certainly not by me, by EverAg, by NPP, the Pork Board or NPPC, who we still do work for. And by the way, you can thank your checkoff dollars for the National Pork Board that support me to go out and do these presentations to states around the country. All producers and packers should do individually what is in their best interest. 2023 right now is going down in the annals as the worst year ever for pork producers. And this is according to the Iowa State University model. If you look at it, 23 losses of 27.71. Back in 1998, which I know a lot of you don't even remember 1998, but I do, and a lot of us do, the ones with this color hair or no hair at all, it was awful. And it was one of the worst times ever. And we went through a great structural change in 1998, from many small farms to a much more consolidated modern business. That's not the case this time. I mean, we're not going through that kind of structural change, but we still had massive losses this last year. If we take, usually it's a 2-year period that's pretty bad. If we take 98 and 99, I'm going to punch the wrong button here. 98 and 99 together, this 2-year period is not going to be quite as bad because 24 continues to look better. That number for 24 on my forecast here was minus $11 back in December. And so we've gained about $10 ahead in the last 60 days on this thing for the average for this year. And it's still trending in the right direction for us at the present time. But you can see we still only have a few months of profits here in the middle of the year. Costs are very high, and it's going to be a very important thing. We'll talk about costs quite a bit. One of the points I will make, though, is that there was a lot more and more effective risk management done in the last year than there was in 1998. So this model is buy corn and buy soybean meal hand to mouth as you need it, and sell pigs on the spot on the cash market, not the spot market necessarily, but at the average price for all barrels and gilts as you're selling them. No risk management, no hedging on corn, no hedging on bean meal, no hedging on hogs. Well, that was probably a pretty good description of how people did business back in 98. It's not now. And there was a lot of active risk management in 2023 that very likely reduced this number below the 2771 that I show you. And part of that is the availability of federally subsidized insurance projects and a number of things, but there was a lot more risk management done last year. So, there are some positive developments here. 24 losses are down, like I say, to less than $2 per head. A significant reduction in the last 60 days on that forecast. 5 profitable months are forecast at this point. 23 exports are going to be up about 6 to 7% when the final data comes out day after tomorrow for December. We'll get that data, and that's about where it's going to be versus 22, and it looks like we're in for another year of growth in 24. Costs are indeed lower, and they may get lower yet. They're trending down. We have a very good crop, we think, developing in South America that's going to help on the world side. And then, who knows what the U.S. crop is going to be this year, but that all depends on planting weather and all the things that are going to affect it. But we're still it looks like we're getting some help there. Wholesale demand has strengthened since July. We had a terrible first half of the year at both the consumer and the wholesale level, but the wholesale level was particularly bad. And it's certainly gotten better since then. I'll show you some evidence of that. Consumer level demand has recovered some, and I put this sum on there a few weeks ago. Actually, when we look at it, it's recovered pretty well. Now, the question is, will it stay here or kind of fall backwards? And we'll talk about that in specific. And finally, herd health has improved sharply, we think, over the last 18, 24 months. Now, that's a really good thing if you're one of those farms that had very poor herd health, PRRS, and those kinds of things. And it's not such a good thing for the market because there's more pigs that survive. And so we're going to have to deal with the productivity impacts of that, plus the genetic capabilities of these animals we get. So restoring profitability require one or more of the three: lower costs, stronger demand, or lower pork supplies. I mean, if you can't get costs down or demand up in order to bring a profit back, then the only other thing you can do is reduce the supply so the price will go up. So these are the three things that are out there. Now, which ones of those do we have control over? One, the last one. We have some influence over this one, over higher demand. I mean, the work that the pork board does with your checkoff dollars helps on this, no question. It has a proven record. We don't have much to say about lower costs. I mean, that's either going to happen at the grain side or it's not. And there are a lot of things that are propping those costs up that are still in place. And so we have to keep that in mind as we go through here. But here's what that cost line looks like. And this is the same line that was in the other chart a while ago. And you can see that this last year, this model said average costs were $97.31. Now you say, boy, that's high. And I'm going to tell you it isn't high enough, because this model really kind of estimates the low-cost 25% of producers. And Dr. Lee Schultz is the guy that keeps this, and he would agree with that. And he and I have talked about it many times. It's probably the better end of our producers on a cost basis. And the average producer is probably $6 higher than that. So I think the average break-even last year for the average producer out there was over $1. I'd say that with a very high degree of confidence. This year, though, you can see right now corn and soybean meal futures are so $86.95. So we've gained a significant amount. That's $8 or $11 per hundredweight, $22 per pig we've gained. The problem is that we have some components of this that aren't going away. Every year, Dr. Schultz at Iowa State reindexes all the values of his non-feed variable cost items. Veterinary medical supplies, labor, energy, all the other things besides feed that goes into variable costs. And over the last 2 years, he's added about $10 a head to the value of those inputs. Every 5 years, he also updates his fixed costs. They don't change nearly as rapidly. And so last year, he went through fixed costs, which is depreciation, interest, repairs, taxes, and insurance. Okay, and he put them up, and they added another $8 per head. So there's $18 roughly of costs that have been added onto this model over the last 2 years. And by the way, I think this number is probably going to go up again when he reindexes it here very soon. The fixed costs may go down a bit. We're having a little bit of moderation of interest rates. And so, we're going to have some changes, but still, those aren't going away. You can get corn back to $3 and bean meal back to $250 a ton, and that $18 a head is still there. And I'll show you that right here. This is the matrix of my formula, and right here is kind of where we are right now. Somewhere, and I point out right here, 461 corn, 361 bean meal is what went into this. So if we take this right here, 361 corn, 461 corn, 361 bean meal, right in there is where we are. Okay, that's where the number is. If we go back to where costs were back, the same corn prices as in 2020 and bean meal prices would be right here. But look at the difference in the cost. This is $79. And if we go back to 2020, it was $63, $68. So just the difference in those other items are adding to cost, and I don't think they're going to go away very much if they do at all. If we got corn all the way down to $2.50 and $2.75, we'd still have $70 break-evens, 10% higher than where we were in 2020. So this is a cost situation that is fundamentally different than we've had in the past. Will we get some gains on it? Well, I think we will. The most likely place is going to come from lower soybean meal prices, in our opinion. We think that's the most likely because there's a strong incentive because of biofuels policy to crush bean meal to get the oil. And we think that bean meal is going to kind of become the byproduct, and it's always a good position to be in if you can buy somebody else's byproduct, because generally it's less expensive. That's also going to be a challenge from the nutritional side that you're going to have to deal with at some point. So my conclusion is buy as low as you can doesn't necessarily mean buy low, okay? It just means buy lower, and so I think you're going to have to do that. I expect this ISU model cost to be in the 80s, not $80, but in the 80s for the foreseeable future. I don't see many circumstances where we can get below $80 on costs here. I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time in the 90s, but if we have a bad crop in the United States, we could certainly be back above 90s very quickly, and I think you need to manage for that. So this is kind of your expectation. So the question becomes, we'll sell as high as you can, get over that cost bar. Now, if the cost bar is 80, I think we got a pretty good shot, or even if it's 85, but if it's 90, it's going to be a difficult task going forward to get there. So let's talk about demand. That's the cost side. On the demand side, we've had a real roller coaster, and this is real per capita expenditures for beef, pork, and chicken. Now, I leave turkey out because I don't have a good retail price from the ERS on that. They have a whole bird price, and I think that's quite misleading about the value of turkey, and so I just use these three species. I add them up, and you can see we've kind of been all over the map. That little bar is in the wrong spot. I need to move that over. This is, of course, the COVID shutdowns in 2020. And notice that we had very strong demand in 21 and again in 22. And in fact, we had 2 record years on real per capita expenditures. This, in effect, measures the position of the meat demand curve in a price quantity space. So if this goes up, demand is strong. But look what happened beginning in the fall of 2022 going into last summer. We had a huge reduction in apparent consumer level demand for pork, beef, and chicken. And then we've had a very good rebound. In fact, that October observation, and I don't have December on here yet because we don't have all the data for December, but that October observation is the 10th highest ever for combined real per capita expenditures. So it's really a very positive story here. The question for this year is, do we go here or do we go back down? And we don't know the answer to that. I wish I could tell you that I had a good crystal ball that predicted demand, but I've been working on that for a long time and have never had any luck at it. So we're going to have to just describe it. This is real per capita expenditures for pork, right? And you see the same kind of thing. This observation in July of last summer is the lowest monthly observation in 10 years for real per capita expenditures for pork. It was not good, all right? That observation in October is the 10th highest ever for pork real per capita expenditures. So in a matter of 4 months, we went from really bad to pretty darn good. And again, the question is, what does the future hold? Well, I think it's a reasonable probability that we're probably going to stay up here in this $16 to $17 per month, and this is in 2019 to $21. So the impact of inflation is taken out of this. It's the real price times per capita consumption where this comes from. If we look at monthly data for these, you can see that we've been below a year ago all year, but the first half of the year was way worse than the second half of the year. And my forecast for December is that we're going to be really close to that number. And in fact, if we take this, the total for the year, this year is going to total almost exactly on the 5-year average for real per capita expenditures on pork. So again, demand isn't what it was in 21 and 22. It's a darn sight better than it was in the first half of 23. But still, I don't even call this poor demand for pork. It's just not as good as it was in the 2 record years that we saw. Beef, they had a really terrible second half of last year, and that carried on into this year. But notice, they're back above that. In the case of chicken, they had a great second half of last year, and then it has fallen off this year and now are well below it. So there's some changes here. Let's think about this for a minute as far as timing. Beef demand started getting soft in the summer of 2022 and was down double digits all the way through the fourth quarter. Pork demand softened in the summer of 2022, but was not down that badly until we got into the first half of 2023. Chicken demand was really, really good in the second half of 22 and started suffering not until just the last half. So you can see the most expensive took the hit first. The next most expensive took the hit on demand next. And the cheapest one really thrived in those early time periods and has taken a hit since then. I think the important thing is that suggests that income is at play here. And if we look back at what consumer incomes were, and this is real disposable personal income per capita from the Commerce Department, and they had an adjustment in a definition right here that causes a discontinuity to this line, but the important one is right here. These things went up dramatically in 2020 and 21. Anybody want to guess where that came from? Trillions of dollars of stimulus payments went into consumers' hands. All right. Now, for years, I've studied economic theory at two really good econ departments, and I know that income is supposed to be a positive influence on the demand for a normal good, and so I would try to estimate my equations here and put an income variable in and say, okay, that should help explain demand here. And every time that income variable would come up just either barely significant from a statistical standpoint or not statistically significant at all. So I've never had an income variable come in. So when this happened in 2020, I think I said it in some of our team meetings, said, well, we're going to have a lot more income in people's hands, but that's never really helped demand in the past very much that I can tell. Okay, I forgot something. I was always dealing with these changes in income instead of that change in income. And magnitude matters, okay? It really does. And in this case, we can trace back the surge in demand, lagged a little bit behind this surge in income. We can trace back the decline in demand, lagged a little behind this income as well. And the correlation is just too strong. I mean, this is really the driver of the 21 and 22 surges in meat demand that we saw was money in people's hands. You also consider that at the same time we gave them all that money, we closed everything down so they didn't have any place to spend it. So what did they do? Well, savings went up dramatically, and again, the surge in savings went with the surge in income, the decline in savings went with the decline in income, and they fit that surge in demand almost perfectly. So I think we know what happened here. Now, given that, how many in here think that we're going to start throwing trillions of dollars at consumers again? Yeah, neither do I. All right? So I don't think this is going to happen again. So if you can keep demand at the pre-21 level, that's probably a really good result. The other thing that can change demand is the price of competitive goods, right? And so we've been looking at this thing for some time, looking over at the beef cattle guys going, let's get these beef prices up because they will help us. Well, and they have. There's the big blip in the ratio of the beef price to the pork price. And they are higher, but not very much higher than they've been over the last decade, the ratio of those prices. Now, this can change. We had a cattle report last week that said that the beef cow herd was down another 2%. And at some point, the price is going to be good enough and we're going to have enough grass out there that somebody starts keeping heifers back out of the supply. When it does, I think this ratio is going to get more positive, and probably help pork demand. But I don't think it's had a big impact so far. And it's one of those great mysteries out there. We've got, we need cows, right? And if you look at the drought map, it's much better than it was a year ago. Now, I live in Oklahoma, and we've got grass, but what we don't have is pond water, all right? Our ponds are dry. So there's some problems in that. But as Randy Block out at Cattle Facts says, you don't have to have two things to get more cows: profits and grass. Okay, and those are going to come, I think. Now, the mystery has been, why hadn't somebody done that already? And I think the answer is that cattlemen look at that 500-pound heifer and say, you want to give me $1,500 for her? She's yours, bud. I mean, they're going to take the cash on that situation, and they have so far. At some point, we will start building that cow herd, and I think when we start tightening the the supply of cattle, we'll see fed cattle prices go up and beef prices with them. Notice the ratio of chicken to pork. I don't think there's ever going to be a lot of help there, folks. I mean, they can change so quickly. If their prices go up, they will grow to take advantage of that. And in fact, they're going to do that somewhat this year. They've certainly suffered from the cost situation that we faced as well, but still not much change in the relative price of chicken and pork to impact demand. So the supply variable for this year, and lots of people look at this and say, well, demand is good because consumption is up. Well, consumption is not demand. Consumption and price comprise demand. And so I look at this not as per capita consumption, but per capita availability. We'll eat what's available to us. The question is at what price? And in fact, this year we think availability is going to go down slightly, just a hair under 50 pounds. And virtually every observation for this variable, all the way back over here to 1980, has been between 50 and 52 pounds. Right? We had a big dip right here because of the ethanol cost shocks that we had to respond to, and we reduced supplies for a few years. But still, that's kind of the number. Now, is that good or bad that we've had 40 years of between 50 and 52 pounds? Well, if you look at it from the standpoint of the chicken business, it's bad because they've been growing. But if you look at it from the standpoint of the beef industry, they would probably kill if they could have stayed within that deal for all that time period, because their per capita availability consumption keeps going down and probably will go down again when they start building the cow herd. So I don't think this is a victory or a defeat. It just is what it is. We're going to tighten supplies a bit. So here's another way to look at demand, and that is a scatter with real price, a deflated price on the y-axis, and per capita availability over here on the x-axis. And here's 23. You can see 21 and 22 are off the charts good. That's the 2 years of extremely good demand. We've fallen back to 23, which is right in line with 19 and 20 and others. These kind of handily fall on these negative slope curves, which is really fortuitous for an economist because that looks like a demand curve. And you can see that we were lots better off in this period than we were in the early 2000s and into 2010 and 11. Okay, demand had been good. It just got a lot better for a couple of years. And now we have to look back and say, okay, well, those were 2 really good years, but we're not really bad off where we are in 23. 24, supplies is going to be right here at about 50 pounds. So I would expect a price somewhere right in here around $4.15 on the deflated retail price of pork. And notice those are all stated in 2019 and $21. So domestic demand. Great 2021-22, not nearly as good in 23, but not as bad as we have been in many, many, many years past. I think we're going to stabilize this thing. Wholesale demand we'll talk about here in just a minute, but I think domestic pork demand is kind of back off the doldrums of the first half of last year and kind of poised to be pretty good this year, not as good as 21 and 22. I don't think we could reasonably expect that in the absence of a big surge in cash to consumers. The export side has been good too, right? Now everybody looks back and sees this and says, well, exports aren't very good. Well, we had this in 2020 and 21 because of this called China, all right? China is not coming back, folks. I don't think they're going to, unless they have something else happen that they've got to have pork. I do not see China being back in our market in any big way for the foreseeable future, and maybe ever. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're not really getting along with those guys very well, all right? And I don't think the outcome of this fall's presidential election is going to make that any better regardless of which way it goes. So I don't think that's coming back, and that's the reason we have these years. In fact, 23 is going to be the best non-African swine fever export year we've ever had. And the reason it is look what's going on with Mexico. Exports to Mexico continue to go up. The peso is strong. They are in our market all the time. I'll show you the numbers. They take more than double our second market, which is Japan, and Japan is in some real trouble, mainly because of the value of the yen, which is way off. Okay, number 3 is China, Hong Kong, still good numbers, just not what they were those years. South Korea is next. We got a little bit of a currency problem there. And Canada is next. These 5 are 80% of our exports. And that's been the case for a long time. But Mexico has become the dominant market and one that we sure depend on. And they're dependent on us. We have to remember that, if you're importing this much product, you don't just shut the door to that. I mean, they've got to have this product. And so we've kind of developed a codependent relationship with Mexico that should serve us well. There's been a lot of talk recently about problems in shipping through the Panama Canal and through the Red Sea with the rebels shooting at ships and all these kind of things. Well, guess what? I don't think there's probably a pound of that right there that ever got on a ship. It goes by truck, and that makes it a pretty good market, one that's a little more dependable, and we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so expectations. China's imports, last year, everybody thought China's imports of pork would go up. They didn't. They went down. There's a real problem with demand in China, I think, on pork. And I don't think it's getting any better. Their economy's softened. They're kind of looking down the barrel of a real estate crisis. We understand their major pork producers are getting propped up pretty strongly by the government. They're not going to let them fail because they got to have the product. And so this is not a very good situation. The 25% punitive tariff on our product is still in place. And that's the result of our tariffs on aluminum and steel under the first Trump administration. Maybe whether there will be another one or not, we'll see. But that's still in place, so the 25% punitive tariff is still there. China buying from anyone else would help us, and last year they didn't do it. Okay, so that's kind of been a drag on the whole deal. And an example of that is Canada. Year before last, we saw a lot of product coming in from Canada. Why? Because they had plants delisted and they couldn't ship it to China. Well, last year they got those plants relisted and our imports from Canada went down sharply. Mexico will remain a strong market. As I say, kind of a codependent relationship. There is a bit of a caution here. Mexico approved imports from Santa Catarina, Brazil last year and brought in some product from there. They've had some legal wrangling over some tariff issues on that since October, but still, that's probably going to make some inroads. Big EU output reductions are really a positive for us, especially to Asia. The EU this year will export about half as much product as they did 5 years ago. Okay, say that again. They were by far the largest exporter in the world. And we're going to be bigger than they are in 2024. So, and that's an availability issue, and that's the result of them actively shooting themselves in the foot in terms of agriculture, in my opinion, and reducing their output, and I don't think it's coming back. So we're going to have some opportunities there in some of these other markets. A big challenge right now, as I pointed out, was the value of the yen and the yuan. Those certainly aren't helping us, but right now the peso has really, really saved us. So this was mid-June last year, and I took here, this is the cutout value versus total pork availability. I talked about retail demand a while ago, or consumer level demand, so I only use per capita consumption in the United States as my quantity variable. Well, this is the wholesale level, and export markets are active at the wholesale level too. So you have to take the quantity variable here is not per cap, it's total pounds. And this is where we were in mid-June. 21, 22 off the charts, 23 was right back there. Okay? Here's where we're going to finish up the year. A pretty nice rebound in wholesale pork demand driven by exports, and that rebound in consumer level demand as well has put us kind of in between here. So I think that's a positive. Our forecast would have 24 to be a little higher. And so I think we're going to get some strength here that really helps us on the demand side. All right, so we talked about costs, we talked about demand, and now we're going to talk about supply. This is the December Hogs and Pigs report. It came in very close to what most people had thought. This is the pre-report estimates as a percentage of a year ago. Here's the actual as a percentage of a year ago. Here's the difference. And you see there's only a couple of numbers in there that are very big, very large differences. One of them is the breeding herd at 96.7%, which was way smaller than what most people expected and smaller than what I expected. But I want to point out that half of that reduction is because USDA went back and added 100,000 sows to last year's breeding herd. They periodically revise these, and of course they revise the inventories of market hogs and the pig crops so that they fit with slaughter. The sow herd is a little more foggy, like this morning, all right? We don't know exactly why. And USDA did this. They revised the last 7 breeding herds up by somewhere between 50 and 100,000 sows, depending on which quarter you're talking about. And they didn't make one mention of it in the report. They have a paragraph, they talk about their revisions. And they didn't make one mention of this revision of the breeding herd. Now, I don't know why they didn't mention it, but I have a little problem with it. I'm a little concerned that it really is sending false kind of optimism that we've cut the breeding herd a whole lot more than we actually have. And I'll show you something about that here in a minute. But still, that number was odd. The other one that was not really out of line, but was certainly large, was this one, pigs saved per litter. Up 3.9% at a record 11.66. They published a monthly number, and the November number for pigs saved per litter was 11.77, also a monthly record. All right, so we're off to the races on productivity, and that's after a while of not doing very much. Their inventories, I always look at the 180 and over and say, does that agree with what slaughter was since December 1st? And they were within about 1.1%, which is kind of on the verge of being worrisome, but not terribly so. So I didn't worry too much about that. Here's this pigs per litter. Now, we have had a real struggle with this for a few years. We were growing at about 1.3% per year, and then we hit COVID right here, and we were flat for 3 years. And there's two reasons for that, in our opinion. Number one, clearly, was the emergence of a new PRRS virus that has been devastating to places that had it. And the second one was we had labor problems. I mean, we had a lot of sow units that were running on 60 or 70% of their normal labor complement, and you just can't get those pigs raised. And so we went sideways. But all during this time period, the breeding companies, who many of you are represented here, are telling us their nucleus herds were still making 1.5% progress per year on pigs weaned per litter. So the gilts that were going back into your units were getting better, and you weren't getting the pigs out of them until last year. And look what happened. We went right back to this long-term trend on pigs per litter over the last year. And this last observation was here for September at plus 3.9% from a year ago. The next observation we think will be higher, and it's going to be compared to that one, and it's probably going to be plus 4%. And then we're going to start comparing to pretty good numbers, so the percentage year over year is going to go down, but the number keeps going up. Now, I don't have a 12 on there, all right? But I wouldn't rule that out sometime, maybe in the next year and a half, that we will average 12 pigs surviving pigs saved per litter. And so we've got this upward trajectory of productivity that we have to consider when we're talking about pig supplies. On the other hand, we're saving more of them. This is incidence of PRRS. It's not a perfect measure of the impact of PRRS by any stretch, but last year ended up the second lowest ever, second only to 2013 and 14. And then look what the cumulative since July 1 is so far this year, well below any year in the past on the incidence of PRRS on sow farms in this sample. Now, you say, okay, it's just sow farms. Yes, it is. But in the sample is half of the sow herd in the United States. It's not a small sample, folks. I mean, you're drawing inference from a whole bunch of animals out there. And so we think that this is going to be something that carries on. How long will it last? Until PRRS mutates again. That'd be my bet, okay? And whenever that is, we'll have troubles again. But right now, I think our labor situation is good. Herd health situation is probably the best it's been in 4 or 5 years. And productivity is just going up. So when we put this together, the inventories plus what's going on there, our forecast for slaughter would be the red smooth line as we go out here. And notice that it looks a whole lot like the last 2 years. I mean, it's not very far off. It's almost perfectly on the 5-year average. Now, the problem we have is so far this year, we hadn't been close to it because of weather. We backed up about 400,000 hogs the second week of January. We've been working through those the last 2 or 3 weeks. I think we're going to be somewhere at about 2.6 million, much closer to our forecast line this week, and we're probably going to be back to it here within the next couple of weeks as we work through this backlog. So I'm not concerned that our forecasts are too far off at this point unless we really get a long period of some deviations here. But the point is very close to the last year and the 5-year average going forward. Notice that our 25 projection right now would put supplies below that. All right, I think we're going to have some reduction in the breeding herd and going to have to cut supplies to get prices back up. If we look at supplies, here would be the total for this year for 23 was 127.9, right at 128. Notice that for this year, we've got it up just a fraction from last year. So after one of the worst economic years we've ever had, we're going to raise more pigs this year than we did last year. Slaughter more pigs. That doesn't make sense, does it? Well, number one is it makes me conclude that there were some things done by risk management that caused that to maybe not be quite as bad a year as what the model says. And number two is we had a really good equity position in the industry going into 2023, and we've had a lot of staying power that people have kind of stayed involved, and now we're looking out, and we've got 2024 pretty much in the can. The sows bred last week will farrow when? November? 1st November? Mid-November? All right, so we're pretty well set for 24, and any adjustments will come in 25. You can compare our numbers to the Livestock Marketing Information Center, to Iowa State University. We're kind of all in the same. We're a little bit on the low side of that. This is USDA's numbers. That's a production number, billion pounds instead of million head. The percentage changes. USDA right now they're a little healthy on this, I think. I think they're a little high, especially in the second half of the year. Weights, they've been kind of all over the map. Last year, of course, weights were way below the 5-year average. Why? Because feed was expensive. People responded to that when we got in here. This was the worst profitability month of that whole one last year, April. Those pigs never ate any cheap feed. They had really expensive feed their whole life. And so we started really rolling back on weights. Well, we kind of gathered back up. We got back to the 5-year average. We're a little heavy right now because of those delayed marketings, that 400,000 pigs that didn't move when they were supposed to. So they're too heavy. We're going to get back down here. I think we're going to see some weight gains for the last 3 quarters of the year that are going to add about a pound to average weights for the year. This is producer or packer raised pigs. They're a little more fickle. And last year they were very high in the spring because Smithfield was having a lot of operation problems in North Carolina. We're going to run below that most of this year and probably get back toward the 5-year average. Carcass cutout value, here's our forecast for the coming year. And you can see better here in the first half. This is that really soft wholesale demand I pointed out earlier. Last year, we're going to be better than that. We think it's going to peak out somewhere up here in about $1.08 or so in the summertime, and then go down. And then better in the fall because we're going to have a little bit lower pig supplies. If we look at all barrels and gilts net price, again, much like last year, kind of shoots the average. This is the poor demand. This is the surge when we made the announcement about Prop 12 last June, when they said, oh, well, you can bring in non-compliant product that you have in stock. Well, we had a big surge in cutout value. We had a big surge in hog prices that took us up to over $1 a pound. Now, this high of 97 or so in July here that I have forecast, that probably will have $1 a pound pigs in it. That's the average for the month. But I wouldn't be surprised to see $1 a pound sometime during that time period for all barrels and gilts net. This is the negotiated. And of course, the negotiated has taken a real hammering in the fourth quarter. Why? Because we've been testing slaughter capacity for the last 2 months, and packers have been in the real power position of buying hogs cheap. We're still very cheap in January. That's going to gain, and we'll probably trade some $90-some negotiated pigs in the summer as well. So when we put this on a quarterly basis, there's my forecast. You can compare them to where the futures were last Friday, and you can see, really, they're not too far off. We think the futures are probably pretty healthy for the summer. They're a little low for the fall, but other than that, they're pretty close to where we are on national net prices. You can see that I'm the optimist here. I've got annual average prices up in the mid to upper 80s, where the other analysts are down in the 70s on this. I think we're going to be quite a bit better off than what they did. This is that CME Lean Hog Index. If you put the cutout value and the negotiated price together, this will be my forecast. $1 a pound somewhere in the summer on the index. There's where the futures are, the green dots. And you can see that the fourth quarter is where we're really kind of lacking here. I don't think that's very good, but the first half of the year, the futures seem to be pretty fairly priced. So what's going to happen to the sow herd? We have to watch sow slaughter. And we don't ever have a direct observation of gilt retention. That kind of comes after the fact when we do the balance sheet. But the first indication is always sow slaughter. And notice last year, we jumped sow slaughter in May, and it stayed high all summer, and it fell off in October. And that almost perfectly coincides to Smithfield Foods liquidating a bunch of sows in Utah and a bunch of sows in northern Missouri. In fact, my conclusion is that they were virtually the only one liquidating sows last year. Not very many others took part. There were a few. There's been a couple of noted ones as we've gone through this winter that have liquidated some sows. The last 2 weeks of purchase data would suggest that we've jumped sow slaughter again. Now, again, that's a compensatory thing for the storm that hit in this week, probably that's jumped up. 70,000 is a really magic number. We have slaughtered 70,000 sows in a week in the United States, I think 8 times in the last 15 years. One of them was last summer. So if we start pushing 70,000, then we're actively reducing the sow herd. We haven't done much of that. And if we look at it as a percentage of the sow herd, you have to slaughter about 1% of the sow herd every week to make any significant reductions in the breeding herd. And we got there last June. And we stayed there for about 3 months, and we dropped back below 1% in October. And you can see USDA says we had a pretty sizable reduction in the breeding herd, but I'm a little skeptical of this. This is the breeding herd, and this is USDA's December number, and that's their revised numbers in past quarters. And you can see we've only had one reduction of that magnitude ever. And so I'm a little skeptical that we're actually there, but we're not too far off 6 million, even if we didn't quite get to 5.999. And so we have reduced the sow herd. The question is, what does that productivity mean? And we haven't reduced it enough to offset the gains that we're seeing in pigs saved per litter yet. And then if we factor in survivability, because our herd health situation is a little better, we're not going to reduce pig supplies this year. It's going to be 25 before that happens. So costs are falling, and the amount will be limited, I think. Maybe the mid-80s, possibly a little bit lower. In the long run, we're going to have more corn and soybean meal. All right? Because why? Yields go up. It's just magic to me what these varieties of corn can do, even without good weather. I mean, we've had record high yields last year, and we didn't have a great year. Okay? What if we ever get the weather right on this thing? And that will help us on this cost side. But it's probably not going to be here to any great degree, at least until 25. And by the way, I mean, if I go 85, that's a $12 per 100 reduction in my model. I mean, that's not chicken feed by any stretch. It's just not anywhere close to the $63 we were back in 2020. Consumer level demand will remain below the 21-22 outliers, but stay at least in there where we were pre-21 levels. And those were very good versus long term. So we shouldn't be really dissatisfied with demand. It's one of those, you never make many friends telling you that you're better off than you ought to be, okay? But actually, we're not bad off except for relative to those 2 years. Exports are going to end up at 23 plus 6 or 7. We'll get the final numbers day after tomorrow. Our friends in the forecasting business on this, Brett Stewart at Global Agri-Trends and Aaron Borer out at USMEF, they've got 4 to 5% growth this year on exports. And that will put us pushing the African swine fever years for total exports, a really, really good level. Wholesale pork prices will be above but close to where they were last year. So I think we're going to have a little gain in the wholesale market as we go through here. The breeding herd will eventually shrink. Now, I made a case last summer that we needed to reduce the breeding herd 10%. I don't think we're going to do that. I don't think we need to do that, given where demand is kind of going at the present time. But I don't think we can get hog prices consistently profitable with a 6 million head breeding herd, especially if we're going to raise 12 pigs per litter out of it. Think about that. 12 pigs, 6 million head, 2 litters a year is 12 million. 12 pigs would be 144 million pigs in the pig crop. That would be well over 130 slaughtered. And I think we're going to have problems with profits at that level. Productivity gains will keep 24 pig and pork supplies above, very near above, probably 23 levels. And pork supplies, I think, will have to eventually decline to get us consistently profitable, but I don't think that's going to happen until late 24 or into 25. So to summarize, in 24 is going to be a better year than 23. It ain't going to be anything to write home about, but if you're in a decent shape on your equity side right now, you can probably keep your money together reasonably well in 24. One point I will make is that there were good opportunities to manage risk in early 23, late 22 for last year. What happens is after the bad year, you never get really good chances to manage risk and enhance your bottom line in the year after that. Now, in this case, we have costs going down that's a little different. It's not just the hog price that we're concerned about. So I think you're going to have some chances to do that. But right now, in a nutshell, we would say, look at the summer months all the way through the summer. You've got pretty good prices. You can do some strategies that would put a floor near these prices and leave the top side open for you. You've got grain prices going down. So that says, let's kind of wait on this thing, but let's look for opportunities to put a lid on our costs and leave the bottom side open on that. And be pretty active about your risk management, especially if your equity position has been eroded significantly over the last year. And I'd say that probably describes many of the operations that we're familiar with and probably most of the ones represented in here today. Joel, if we got time for a question or two, I'd be glad to take one. I always prefer if you don't start out with Steve, you idiot. Okay?
We'll have time for a couple questions here, and during that time we'll change over to the next presentation, but we'll certainly get some questions in. So what questions do you have for Steve? Yes.
Go ahead, I can hear you.
If the FDA approves the PRRS resistant CD163 knockout pigs, what will that influence?
If the FDA approves the PRRS gene-deleted pigs, what will that do? I'd like to know about that as soon as it's approved because it's going to make a difference. We have a dry run on this. Now, there's a significant difference. In 2007, we arrived at circovirus vaccines. And we had a slug of pigs in 2008. And it would have been an unmitigated disaster, except the Chinese had the Summer Olympics in 2008, and they got into our market buying a lot of pork. They didn't want any big protests in the streets in China when everybody was looking, and they kind of saved our tail on that. I mean, it would have been a terrible situation because there were a lot of pigs that had been dying, and quickly we had something that kept them from dying, and they went to market. It would have been a bad deal, except for that. So we got a bit of a dry run. Now, the thing on the gene-deleted pigs is that's going to come into the marketplace much more slowly because you've got to get it on both sides of the parent to get the pig that works. I think it's a recessive trait. And so it's not going to be very quick, but eventually you will get a significant increase in survivability. It probably, I guess it will affect certainly pigs saved per litter, but the thing it'll really affect is how many of them make it to market because you won't have all those grow finish losses. So it will have a, ceteris paribus, all else held constant, it will eventually have a negative impact on hog prices. But it was going to happen so slowly that we may not notice it very much. I mean, really. We've got a kind of a current situation that's an example of that. I've had a lot of questions in the last 3 weeks about, man, they started enforcing Prop 12 on January 1st and we haven't really seen anything happen. I said, yeah, because everybody expected it. It was all built into what was going on. The shock for Prop 12 was the announcement last June that they were going to make an exception for non-committed product to be sold starting on July 1 if you had it in inventory. That's the shock. And you saw what happened to hog prices and the cutout value. They went up dramatically because it was a shock. This one has been anticipated for months, and we really didn't see anything. We haven't seen anything out of the ordinary recently. So that would be kind of, the gene-deleted pig would be that on steroids to a great degree, but I think it's going to happen so slowly that we may not even see a market impact.
We can take one more question.
Yeah. Well, what are our data sources that you could keep an eye on so that you may have a feel for demand and supply in the marketplace? Well, first, you could subscribe to EverAg's service. So that'd be the first thing I'd do. So Mike Worth, I earned my paycheck right there, bud. Yeah, here's the problem is we get a lot of data. And we are absolutely blessed and cursed with all the data we get. All right? It's flip side of the same coin. USDA provides us a lot of price data. The mandatory price reporting system, I believe, provides us an accurate snapshot of what pigs are bought in a given day and what are slaughtered and what the prices of those. Okay, I think it's I think you can lean on the weighted averages there. We have a completely public futures market, and it certainly tells you what somebody thinks during a day, but it might or might not be right for a future time period. But when you boil it down to supply and demand, you have to go a lot further past what the slaughter was yesterday and what the price was yesterday. And so you can have a feel for what the market is, prices, how many pigs are coming to town, all those kind of things. But if you don't go deeper than that and do some analysis of, the relative quantities, what was expected this week, I would tell you that what was killed this week is important only relative to what we expected to be killed this week. And if there's a difference, is there an explanation? It's just like I pointed. 3 weeks ago, we were way short. Well, it wasn't because we didn't have the hogs. We just couldn't get them to town or we couldn't get the workers there. The last 2 weeks, we've had lots of pigs. Well, it's because we're catching up. So you have to have some idea of what to expect. And unless you've got, in my opinion, unless you've got a trained person that's giving you that information, you're probably shooting in the dark. And so if you're not big enough to have one of those on your own staff, then I would strongly urge you to subscribe to one of us that does that kind of analysis. And so I know that's a self-serving statement, but I believe that's absolutely the truth.
Well, good. Let's give Steve a big round of applause
Thank you.
for his information.